And welcome to the Grid Snaps Podcast. Rob Howard here with Patrick. The Grid Snaps Podcast, however, is not for long, folks. Not for long. It's on life support. No, just kidding. It's not that bad. We're going to continue. It's just not going to be called that anymore. We're going to rebrand it into something else entirely. So, Patrick, does this excite you? Does this tingle your senses that we're going to broaden our horizons perhaps a bit?
I'm already dreaming of the possibilities, Rom.
That's right. So what do we mean by this? So obviously, I just want to be clear to the current listeners. Video games are still kind of going to be a home base for us. That's kind of our base of operations, our modus operandi, our oeuvre, however you want to put it. So there'll be lots and lots and lots of video game content. But, we're sophisticated Renaissance men here on this show, and we have lots of interests. And, I'll just have to admit, I would have these long rants to you, Patrick, about old detective TV shows or whatever, and I'm like, I'd like to talk about this on a podcast, but it doesn't really fit a podcast that's not only just a video game podcast, but originally it was meant to be a level design specific podcast. Now we kind of had to broaden immediately beyond that to make that work. But, I kind of want to talk about all things that we kind of like in terms of creative media and so on. And so, yeah, I think it'll just make things a lot more fun whilst video games still being, a major part of that. So, Patrick, I have to say, I badgered you into watching Columbo. That's the old TV series I'm talking about. You just finished this 1970s run of the show, right? I do believe you finished.
Yep. After some extreme badgering, I did finally get through all 7 seasons. It
Yes.
was pretty extreme back-to-back viewing to meet the rigorous timeline that you had set down before me. But I made it. I made it through.
And hopefully you found it worthwhile. I've watched all of those episodes multiple times. I'm not ashamed to say. It happened, what's interesting is it happened for me when my second child was born, and I had to spend a lot of time late at night, getting her to sleep and all that. And that's when I'd go through Amazon and Netflix and just like watching virtually everything that they had while I was getting this kid to sleep or whatever. And I vaguely remembered Columbo growing up, because those TV specials were going until like 2003. So it was kind of an ever-present thing on television, growing up, people of our age, it was just kind of on all the time. At least it felt like it. So whatever. I like detective fiction. I like detective stuff. I'll give it a chance. And I discovered it was great. I mean, really high quality, sort of, I would call it what they call prestige television now. Things like The Mandalorian and Game of Thrones and Walking Dead and all this prestige TV. It was sort of that concept before we got a name for it, especially in the 70s. Now, I think the 1989 to 2003 run, it wasn't quite as high quality in terms of production values, in the back half of Peter Falk's life, but the 70s series was just very well done. I mean, Steven Spielberg directed an episode. I mean, it had great writers. I mean, it had people like Patrick McGoohan directing and starring in episodes. It's really high quality 1970s television in every way. So we'll get into that a little more, though. I don't want to completely spoil what we're going to be talking about. So what is today's topic other than sort of talking about the future direction of this show? We're going to call it something else to start the new year. We don't know what that name is. Maybe you can send me a message, Rojo Games on Twitter, if you figure out a really cool name for this, for kind of a show that's going to be about many different things. But today is about 2020, and I want to keep it positive because obviously, it's been a negative year for just about all of us for some reason or another. So I want to keep this positive, just your usual year in review thing. And so, Patrick, I want to kind of kick it back to you in terms of, we'll start with games, video gaming. Your favorite game or most notable or one that stuck in your mind the most throughout 2020?
Yep. So actually, it's a game that I had previously played but revisited in 2020. Actually, not even just a game, but a game series. So during the whole pandemic piece, I was staying with a friend for a while, and he asked me one day because I had the PS4 out and we were poking around with PS4 games, and he says, "Hey, do you have something that's like Gears of War on this?" And I thought to myself, and I said, like Gears of War. And then it occurred to me what game I should show him. And so I busted out Earth Defense Force 5. And we proceeded to play that local. I played the Ranger. He was playing the Wing Diver, blasting giant insects to bits in spectacular fashion. Hopefully, people listening have heard us talk about Earth Defense Force before, but basically the premise is it's a third person view action shooter game where you're basically thrown into an open map and you can destroy anything and everything, whether it's the insects, whether it's the spaceships that are dropping the alien insects onto the planet, whether it's the buildings all around you. Everything just can be blown to pieces. So we played a whole bunch of that, and after we'd played it for a few hours, he looked at me and he said, "When I asked for something like Gears of War, this was exactly what I needed." And the verdict is that it's much better than Gears of War, by the way.
Right. Well, that's great. And of course, I encourage everyone watching and listening. We did a podcast on the Earth Defense Force series, so definitely check that out. And we dive deep into that. And of course, if you don't know, I myself was a developer on the one American EDF. So it's obviously a series near and dear to my heart, having, there's not that many people in the United States that can say they worked on the Earth Defense Force game. I'm one of the few. Kind of one cool thing, about my career. So I'm not surprised, though, because I think when someone says that, I want that Gears of War itch, I think it would be unwise to just assume they mean a cover shooter, right? I think what they meant was action, right? They wanted some high action, sort of, arcade-esque, but in a modern context. And I will be honest, I do think Earth Defense Force scratches that itch actually better than Gears of War, because there's still, and one may prefer this, and that's fine, but in Gears of War, there's enough attempts to be tactical in certain ways that, you're not going to have in EDF. There's tactics in EDF and strategy, but you have to get some layers deep, when you think about your loadouts and how you manage the horde and everything. But just to get going, it's just, there's no ammo to worry about. You just go, 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 go. Whereas even a game like Gears of War, I think there's going to be some tutorializing needed if you're not used to playing games in that genre.
Yep, I would agree. And the other thing about Gears of War versus Earth Defense Force, because you're mentioning being tactical, and I think there's some of that in both games, but you can see it more plainly. You can see the path that the developers want you to go down more plainly in Gears of War, whereas in Earth Defense Force, it feels more open. Now, after playing it a long time, because believe me, we played it a long time. You can actually see where soldiers have been placed and everything, where there is a quote unquote preferred path through the stages in EDF, but it doesn't feel quite so obvious. So it's certainly very tactical, but it feels more like you're coming up with your own tactics as opposed to following the tactics that have been laid down in front of you.
Right. And so I remember you talking about that at the time, and I'll share one of my gaming experiences, and I'll go ahead and change the view screen for those watching here. Okay, so my game that I played in early 2020 was Fire Emblem Three Houses. It was a Christmas gift, Christmas 2019, and I probably started playing it probably around March, I'm thinking, if I remember right. And it is a game with a lot of content, so it probably wasn't until the end of the semester. I say the semester because that's my gig now. I teach, so I think in terms of semesters again. So I think probably by the time the semester was over in May, I was about done with it. I'm a huge Fire Emblem fan. I've really enjoyed them ever since. I think the first one I ever played was the Sacred Stones on the Game Boy Advance, and I've loved them really ever since. And this is not, I wouldn't say this one is my favorite of all time. I still think that would be the very first 3DS Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem Awakening. That's probably my all-time favorite of all of them. This is right up there, though. I think it's really good. I do think the previous Fire Emblem, which was actually broken apart kind of Pokemon style into several different games, Fire Emblem Conquest, Fire Emblem Fates, Fire Emblem blah, blah, blah. I liked it, but I sort of thought that, if you remember in the history of development for Fire Emblem, they made all these games of sort of niche popularity. I think they were always probably quite popular in Japan, I guess, but certainly in America, they didn't become anything like a popular game until they started putting them in Smash Brothers games, the characters. And then you started getting them on the Game Boy Advance, and you started getting them on there was a Fire Emblem on the GameCube, I think Path of Radiance, I believe, which I did play that as well. And there was a Fire Emblem on the Wii, which is actually pretty well regarded and I think hard to get and a little bit expensive now. So these were all Fire Emblems. They were making them and all that, but they weren't getting a huge audience. So they told Intelligent Systems, which is the internal developer at Nintendo, hey, you need to deliver the goods here commercially. This is going to be your last Fire Emblem. They did this with Awakening, and they threw the kitchen sink at it. With a greatly enhanced sort of relationship system between the characters and all kinds of interesting world building things, and it was massively successful. So I feel like the game before Three Houses, they sort of did that thing where they were like, okay, this game where we threw everything but the kitchen sink at it succeeded, so for the next one we're going to do that even more, right? It's kind of like the difference between Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, where it's like in Resident Evil 4 and 5, they were like, wow, when we really ramped up the Michael Bay-esque action, this really resonated. So for Resident Evil 6, we're going to go, 15 out of 10 on that, to where it kind of breaks the spell the game is trying to make a little bit. It almost becomes too much of a good thing. I think that's what happened with the previous Fire Emblem. This one I think is a good step forward, where, some of those newer elements are there, but it's not quite as sort of, crazy town as I think the last games were. So I think it's a very good game. I'd put it in top 3 or 4 Fire Emblem games I've played. And so now that I've pontificated about that, Patrick, do you have another gaming experience of 2020 that you remember fondly or even negatively?
Yeah, yep, I do. But first, I wanted to throw a note out there because you mentioned the Fire Emblem on the Wii.
Right.
It did get a second print, but it's still going to be pretty pricey. So anyone who wants that should probably be heading to eBay.
Ah, right. Yep.
Just gets ridiculous like the GameCube one.
Right.
So, yep. Another game that I played, and this is actually one that came out in 2020, is Kandagawa Jet Girls on the PS4. It's a jet ski racing game from the people who made Senran Kagura, but without all of the stuff that Senran Kagura is known for. Well, I mean, it got girls on jet skis, but it's really a jet ski racing game.
Right.
And I actually played that enough to platinum it. It's been a while since I played a good, whether it's jet ski, whether it's like Hydro Thunder game, since I played a good game in that vein. So that was a nice change of pace. It was a little bit too easy. I still think Hydro Thunder, especially the one that was released on Xbox 360 and PS3 is better, but it definitely scratched that itch for me because I'm a fan of racing games in general, and the water racing is kind of its own little subgenre within that I particularly enjoy.
Right. Yeah, that sounds awesome. It reminds me a little bit of playing Wave Race on the N64 back when I had an N64. I think you're right. There's something about racing in water that has just a completely different. I mean, no, that sounds obvious when you say it, right? Of course, it's supposed to have a completely
Right.
different feel, but it does, right? And it's cool. It's a fun thing to sort of have that buoyancy in the water, and those kinds of physics, which is interesting because I think if you apply those physics to a car on a track, it would feel terrible because your brain would fry a little bit.
Right.
The floatiness is accepted when it's on the water. Um, so for me, the next game I remember, it's probably not the only game that I was playing in between, I guess, but I finally got around to playing Yakuza Judgment in the summer. So let me get that up on the screen here. So that is, for those of you that don't know, it's a long-running series. Again, we did a podcast on it, really good. Actually, it's one of our popular episodes. Check it out. And so, long-running Sega series of open-world, sort of organized crime in Japan themed games. Mistakenly, I would say, thought of as the Grand Theft Auto from Japan. It doesn't really play like those games at all. They're really their own thing, and you can't really even say. I think it would also be a mistake to say that they're a brawler. They are, but it's more, you have to experience them. It's an open world game with brawling components, but they are really unique. So Judgment, what makes that interesting is, okay, so you have Yakuza 1 through 6, and not even 1 through 6. You have 1 through 6, but you also have the remakes of 1 and 2, which is Yakuza Kiwami 1 and 2, right? So you have all these games, and you have all the spin-offs. You have the one that takes place in the Meiji Restoration era. You have I think a few other spin-offs. You have the zombie spin-off, which is actually really good. Yakuza Dead Souls. So all of those games featured Kazuma Kiryu as the main character or as a major character in the game, or in the case of the Meiji Restoration, it's like an ancestor or whatever. So it's always been, Kazuma and the gang, right? Goro Majima and various other characters that are involved in the Tojo clan, all that. So Yakuza Judgment is, to my knowledge, the first one that has new characters that are not Kazuma Kiryu, and that would be the main character you see on the screen here, and he is a detective, basically. Now there is a Yakuza connection, an organized crime connection that he has, but he himself is not one. So that's another thing that makes the game a little different. So part of the game is, yes, investigating things as a detective. It's always an interesting thing in gaming. How do you represent detective work? And by the way, I did a podcast, a solo podcast on this game, so you can go and listen to that if you want to hear more about it. But it was a lot of fun. I think they walk that tightrope well of simulating being a detective, especially the things with the drones where you control a little drone to spy on people to get information. I thought that was cool. I could totally see a detective doing that, a modern day detective. But it also has lots and lots of excuses to fight, right? Of course, obviously, like any of these games do. There's cool mini games like they have, and on and on. Patrick, you've played a few of the Yakuza games. Have you gotten to this one yet? I'm not sure you have.
I haven't tried Judgment yet. Obviously, I want to because, as you mentioned, I mean, the Yakuza games in general are pretty good. As I've said before, it's basically like Shenmue except good, and so that's well. I mean, we all know it's true, even if we don't want to say it. But yeah, no, I haven't gotten to Judgment yet. I'm actually still pushing through Yakuza 0. I've played some of the others in the past, but I've been kind of dawdling, and so I definitely need to push through 0 so that I can start moving on to some of the others.
Yeah, and you should. And here's the thing about the Yakuza games. You know how we rank games. We sort of be like, well, this one's a good one. I just was doing that with Fire Emblem. I find that with the Yakuza games, there really isn't one where I'm just like, well, that's the stinker. That's the bad one. Avoid that. Don't play that one. There really isn't, right? If I look at all of them, and I've played every single one except for the newest one, Yakuza Like a Dragon, which is doing, I think, very, very well, at least critically doing very, very well. I've heard lots of really good things about it. So I will play it, I'm sure, very shortly into 2021. But when I rank them, I'm like, there really is not a bad one. There's just ones I like more, which I think is really unique when you have this many games in the series. Like, if I had to put one at the bottom, I mean, it would maybe be the Meiji Restoration one, but I haven't played that one all that much. It's also not localized. So, that almost by default, but it's not really because it's bad or anything. Yakuza 0, the one you mentioned, Patrick, would be still my favorite out of all of them. I think that's just a spectacular entry. But there's so many good ones. They're all good in their own way. I mean, maybe I would put Kiwami 1 and 2 a little lower down only because they are remakes, but it's not because they aren't good. I enjoyed them a lot. But so just putting the remakes aside, I would say Yakuza 0 is my favorite. I would say Yakuza 4, 4 and 5 are right up there because it's really fun to play as those different characters. You play as many different characters in those in 4 and 5. In fact, I think you play as 5 different characters in Yakuza 5, so that's pretty cool. And I like, Yakuza 3 a lot, which is the first HD era Yakuza game that came out. So, and Dead Souls is an amazing. So they're all so good. I mean, there's really not. You can just randomly pick one and be fine. Which I think is pretty rare. Is there another series, Patrick, that you know of that's like this, where you can just kind of randomly pick a game in it and you're just going to be okay?
Well, there are, but the ones that are coming to mind right now aren't necessarily like the series where you could even find any of them just on the shelf. But
Right,
I
right.
mean, for example, the Panzer Dragoon games, every single one of those, because there were 4 of them and they were all excellent. Actually, funny I mention that now because I think the remake of the first one is at Best Buys right now. If people did want to try Panzer Dragoon, so actually, May, that's good timing. It just came out.
Nice.
Um, but that would be one that comes to mind. I'm trying to think of something that's maybe uh, uh, has more entries or is more commercially successful. And right now, I'm not thinking of
What
one
about
because
the
certainly
what about
series
the
like
Ease
Final.
games? Because you're a huge Falcom fan. There's a
Yeah.
ton of Ease games. Are any of those just like stinkers to avoid, or are they all
Uh,
like pretty good?
so any of the ones that anyone would pick up for any modern gaming system are good.
Right. Okay.
So none of them are stinkers. Going back, looking throughout the entire history of the series, the Super Nintendo ones. I'm talking specifically about parts 4 and 5. Not that great. Some people thought part 3 in general was not that great, but then Falcom remade part 3, and it was the best one in the series up to that point. So yeah, so the Ease games, if you're looking at anything from like PSP beyond, you can't go wrong with that.
And that actually is a good segue. And I actually neglected, so I'm going to do this right now. Do it live. Get an image up of here. Image of this game because I did finish it. I didn't start it in 2020, but I finished it in 2020. And it's talking about Falcom. And we podcasted about this. That's the thing. Every game we're talking about here, except maybe for Fire Emblem Three Houses, we podcasted about specifically.
And Kandagawa Jet Girls. We didn't podcast that one yet either.
We did not, and I somehow suspect we may not find time to get to it. So it would be Tokyo Xanadu is what I'm talking about here. That is a game I finished this year and spent a lot of time. I started it in I think the late spring of 2019, and this happens with JRPGs with me. I'll start them, and then I'll put them down, and then I'll pick them back up. And when you're talking about a game with 70, 80, 90 hours of content, that means it's going to take you like a year and a half to get through it or whatever. And that's fine. I actually have no problem with that if I find the game suitably compelling and I have an interesting contrast to make a little bit later if another game I played later this year that's similar. But to tease that. But yeah, I completed Tokyo Xanadu this year. It's a wonderful game. I get that it's not. I mean, I've had some friends play it and they've kind of reported back, oh, geez, I don't know about this. So for some reason, I think it's somehow a little bit niche, but I've also had people say they really liked it. So I'm not exactly sure, because I think it's great, why, because the reviews that it gets are sort of meh from some people, but I don't agree with them really. So it's hard to know why it wasn't more celebrated, honestly, when it came out. I mean, it was originally a Vita game. I think the last time I brought this up, I said PSP accidentally, and raged Patrick, but so I got it right this time.
Yeah.
It was a Vita game originally, so it's not going to, exploit your PS4, certainly not PS5 if that's what you have now, to any, to its full extent at all. It was meant to be a handheld game, which I actually think helps it quite a bit, Patrick. I think that makes it a better game. You've played it a little bit. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of being able to pick it up and come back to it and everything like that, yeah, that handheld mentality makes it very easy to return to. Because one thing with RPGs is that sometimes if you stop playing it and then come back to it in a few months, it's it almost feels like you should just start the game over because you've forgotten the systems, you've forgotten how to play, everything like that. And Tokyo Xanadu is not at all like that. You can jump right back into that one really easily because it was designed to be like that.
Right.
That's part of the handheld design. And one thing I would mention, because when you're talking about how it wouldn't push visually the PS4, PS5, which is completely true, it won't. But like all of Falcom's modern games, it has a very strong presentation and cinematic style. So it's still going to look cool because of the way they present things. Like when you enter a dungeon for the first time and it does a little pan over the dungeon, and it's not anything spectacular, but they make it feel special that you're in a new place, or
Right.
when a boss pops up. They do little things with the camera, with on screen text, and everything like that. Sounds mundane to describe, but in effect, it's really what developers should do when they're
Right.
making these kinds of games.
Yep, absolutely. And I really had a lot of fun with this. I really like the characters. I like the utter wholesomeness of this, which I'm going to be honest, you don't always get the wholesomeness with, Japanese games sometimes, especially ones that have a sort of dating component, which this one sort of does, or a relationship component. They can, I'll just politely say that some of those games, they do some elements of what we would call fan service, basically. Really, Tokyo Xanadu doesn't make you feel odd in that sense. They're just the nicest high school kids. They're the type of high school kids that are going to help little old ladies across the street. They're going to do a bake sale to raise funds for the football team. They're going to adopt a highway, right? These are amazing kids, right? These are upstanding individuals, which is kind of a contrast to the game we're going to talk about later, which I actually really like a lot too, but is not as wholesome in that way, and it's kind of an interesting contrast. But the gameplay, it was my first exposure to Falcom, and it. Other than and Patrick's gonna cringe when I say this. Other than Xanadu, which wasn't really Falcom, right? But
It was Hudson.
right.
Yep.
So other than that sort of exposure, so I really liked the action RPG systems because there's enough meat there. It's that balance where if it was like a Platinum Games, if it was like a Bayonetta thing, or whatever, where it's really you really have to zone in to get that combat right, and to, really feel like you're going to do it well, then that could be maybe a little bit too much, but there's enough here. But if it's too simple, then you feel like you're not doing anything. It's got a really nice blend of strategy and button mashing. It's really a lot of fun, I think, Patrick. So, is this sort of what Falcom action is like in general, or is it different?
No, in terms of the action aspects, it's very much in line with Falcom's other action RPGs.
And so that reminds me, because now that we're talking, I'm recalling all these games. You always do this when you're like, what games did you play this year? And then you're like, I played nothing. Well, actually, no, I played a bunch of different things. When I actually think about it. So I'm actually getting an image up for this one as well. Nier Automata was another game that I played. Obviously, a game that did not come out. A lot of these games we were talking about didn't necessarily come out in 2020. It's just the games we happened to play this year. And with this one, this one was obviously an extremely well-regarded game. It's like a favorite game of numerous friends that I have, in and out of the industry. They'll say this was just like my game of the year that year. I actually saw Yoko Taro speak at GDC, and yes, he wore the mask thing there, although he didn't wear it the whole time. He actually had it off for a while, which I understand is quite rare. Then he put it on sort of halfway through or his speech or whatever, at the conference. So I'll share my impression, and I know it's been a lot longer ago since you've played it, Patrick, but you can give yours. So here's my thing. Great combat, awesome world, right? I love the boldness in the game design. Like, okay, we're going to have some bullet hell elements. We're going to have overhead shooting elements. We're going to pan the camera out, and we're going to make it like a side scroller in this moment. I mean, it's very bold, and you're not used to seeing that in anyone, from anybody really. It's that kind of boldness where you're doing a whole bunch of different things. It breaks a lot of conventional rules of development, which is you don't want to do 10 genres okay, you want to do one genre great, and that would just be conventional wisdom. If someone in a AAA studio in America tried to do those things, they would be shouted down because that's just not how you make games, right? So I really admired that part of it a lot, and I enjoyed that part of it a lot. I will say for me personally, I got through about 15 hours of it, got through the first ending, and man, that world is bleak. It is a bleak, depressing world, and it was just one of those things. And maybe 2020 is to blame, right? Because we're probably not in the mood for bleak, depressing things in 2020, perhaps. And so I'm like, I got a good taste. 15 hours is enough. I can move on. What did you think of it, Patrick? Do you have any recollections?
Nothing that you've said is inaccurate. I mean, it's absolutely a fantastic game, super smooth combat, bleak world, absolutely. And you were talking about the reception, both critically and commercially, it's done really well, which it's interesting that it did really well because the company that originated it actually went out of business, and it's only after they went out of business and were pulled back to make a sequel that they found any commercial success.
Right.
So kind of tragic, but good there. But it did well enough that they are releasing the previous Nier game on PS4, probably Xbox and other systems. I mean, I don't have the full catalog, but Nier Replicant is coming out, which is basically an HD remake of the first game. And I consider this next part unfortunate. Some people will be glad, but I think it's unfortunate. What they're bringing out here, Nier Replicant, is there were two versions of the first Nier game. One is where you play as the Bishonen brother to this young girl, and then the other one is where you play as the grizzled old father to the young girl. And in the US, we got the version where you played as the grizzled old father. In Japan, they got the brother version. What we're getting is the brother version, but I consider that unfortunate because I really liked that dynamic, that father-daughter dynamic in the first game. So it's going to be a little bit different, but that's okay because it's still a fantastic game also. Probably not as good as Nier Automata, so I expect that there probably will be some disappointment unless they've made a bunch of changes to it. But still a great game, which does a lot of the crazy things that you're talking about, where you're fighting a boss and it's just spraying out bullets, so it almost feels like a bullet hell shooter. Just mixing all kinds of genres, all of that.
And another game that I thought of that I'm still playing. So far I've mentioned games that I kind of finished or put aside. I finished Judgment. I finished Three Houses. I kind of just decided I was done with Nier Automata. There's one I'm in progress that I got in March, and I've kind of been pecking away at here and there, and I've been enjoying it when I have been, and I'm just trying to find a reasonably good image of it that I can throw up here, and that would be Ys 8 on the Switch, which is Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana. Am I saying that right? I hope I'm saying that right. Am I saying that right, Patrick?
Sure.
Yeah, good enough. Good enough for jazz, as they say. And so I'm just struggling to find a good screenshot here. Every time I click on one, it goes into something, some other screen that I don't want it to go to. Let's try this one. Okay, I guess that'll have to do. Let me get that up so people can see what that looks like. And so, yeah, like this is my second Falcom game, right? Tokyo Xanadu being my first one, and this is my second Falcom game, and even though it doesn't have that like modern Japan thing, it's a fantasy game, and I kind of like it when RPGs break that mold. I am digging this. I am digging this anyway, because for the same reasons why I like Tokyo Xanadu, the combat is really fun. I do appreciate some of the systems where it's like you're on an island and you're sort of, you have to build up your party. You're kind of, your shipwrecked fellows, you find them, and then they help you remove obstacles, and then the island expands. It's kind of a cool way to do it. Now, one thing I wanted to mention to you, Patrick, because you are a great expert in Falcom, is this character that you play as. I think his last name is Kristen, I think.
Yep.
So
yep. Adol Kristen.
Is this a recurring character throughout numerous Ys games?
Yep, he is. So the first Ys game I played was back on the TurboGrafx CD, Ys 1 and 2. And on Ys 1, he's actually getting off a boat. On Ys 2, he's found lost in a new land, unconscious. In Ys 3, he's shipwrecked, and basically ever since then he gets shipwrecked every single game. Because that's a way that they can explain why this character you play as in every single game does not have all of his awesome armor and equipment that he had before.
Right.
They basically, he's shipwrecked, or some other method of hurtling him into a new land where he ends up losing everything and unconscious. So they actually explain that so that way. I guess they felt that it needed at least that minimal amount of suspension of disbelief if you're going to play as the same character in every game.
Right. And that's cool. And it's a wonderful game on Switch, right? Because even though it wasn't necessarily designed for handheld like Tokyo Xanadu, it still seems to have that, like, yes, it's an RPG. It has RPG systems, but I've picked it up on and off, and I don't feel like I've been hurt by that.
Right. Yeah, they've always been very playable, except for maybe Ys 5 started to go more of the traditional RPG route, but then there was like a gap of 7 or 8 years before the next Ys, and I think it's because that one was not very good. But on the topic of Falcom, I was going to say, you said that this is your second Falcom game, and we already know what your third will be.
Yes, that'd be...
the game.
Yep. Yes, there's Tales of Cold Steel, right? I have that sitting.
Yep.
Trails. Yep. Is it Trails of Cold Steel?
Trails. Yep.
Yes, Trails of Cold Steel. That's sitting in the shrink wrap, and in my TV stand right now. So that'll be a game of 2021, most likely. We'll see. And looking forward to getting to that. It was reasonably inexpensive on PS4, so easy to kind of have that ready to go. By the way, you might be wondering if you're listening, like, do you guys ever play AAA, like, Western releases? And to me, the answer is this. I really wanted to play Ghost of Tsushima this year, but I just didn't get to it. And I didn't want to spend money on a AAA game that was going to be $60. I think it is cheaper now, without, thinking I was going to get to it right away. So that is definitely going to be a game I tackle in 2021 for sure. Definitely want to play that. Very interested in it. But gosh, for me... this was not a year in which the AAA industry in the West delivered a lot that I was super duper excited about. I knew Cyberpunk 2077 looked cool, but I also knew I had no idea that it would be kind of this disaster in terms of the current gen consoles not running it well. But I also knew it was probably not going to run well in those. And once I kind of made that decision that I am not going to upgrade my PC. My PC can run games just fine, but it's it's getting long in the tooth now. I upgraded the graphics card last year, but it was a mid-range card, so it'll probably run okay on my PC. But I'm like, certain games I would rather play on a console, so I'll just wait until eventually I get a PS5 or something. I don't know. Do you have any feelings about Cyberpunk 2077? Does that tickle your fancy at all?
Definitely a game that I'm interested in because of the cyberpunk theme and everything like
Right.
that. I am disappointed that it's uh, not better geared towards the. Yeah, I guess now it's not the current gen of consoles, the last gen, but I
Right.
am disappointed that it's not better geared towards that because that really restricts the audience who can play it, including me,
Yep.
because good luck finding one of the current consoles. And yeah, I don't feel like upgrading a PC for one game. Sorry, won't do it.
Right. And my policy, people would think, well, you're in the industry, Rob. You have to get all the consoles immediately. And my stance on that is, well, I'll do that for Nintendo consoles. I'll get them immediately. I've never felt like I've profited as a gamer from having a Sony or Microsoft console at launch. Now, the Sony console, I will definitely be on that. I'll get a PS5 probably next year, maybe even as early as the next Earth Defense Force game comes out. Like that'll be the big drive for us, I think, both to get one. But that's because look, we both love Japanese games a lot, and it's going to be Nintendo and Sony, Sony and Nintendo, right? That's just generally how it goes. And so really, the one I'm really not motivated to get right now is the Xbox One X, especially because I had an Xbox One, and yes, I had the Master Chief Collection on it, and that was cool, but that was really it, and it was the least used of all the consoles I had last year, so I'm just not hot to trot to update my consoles right now. I'm happy to roll with the Switch, PS4 as my, and sometimes PC is my gaming sort of systems of choice. Is that kind of where you're at, Patrick? Switch, PS4, maybe a little PC?
Yep. Yep, pretty much. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've got so many games here that I still need to play through that there is very little reason for me to pick up any new console right now. Once the games start coming, then we'll reevaluate. But
Right.
right now, don't really need them, so I can certainly wait.
So moving on ahead here throughout our kind of year in gaming. So we talked about I talked about Ease 8. I talked about Yakuza Judgment. So the next one that I really got into for a while, and I really got deep into this for a while, much to the chagrin of my wife, which I'll explain in a little bit, would be this game I just put on the screen, Persona 5. And again, this, as you can tell, this was a big backlog clearing year for me. This was a year where I had some games on the shelf that I hadn't gotten to, and I needed to get to them. So this is not Persona 5 Royal. This is just Persona 5. It's the red label greatest hits Persona, so at least I didn't have to pay much. And I'm really happy with this game. I'm super glad I played it. I put like 90 hours in it. I will say, straight away that I have kind of run out of gas on it a bit. And in a second, I'll talk about maybe why that is. But lots to like. I mean, obviously, look, it's Atlas, who, and they create awesome RPGs. The whole, Megaten universe, which honestly, most people entered the Megaten universe through not just Persona games, but possibly Persona 5. And they online, I know there's a lot of people that joke about this, that there's a lot of people that's all they played, it's the only Atlas game they played was Persona 5, right? And they don't understand that there's Shin Megami Tensei and all these other games that are kind of in that overall sphere. But I've always preferred the Persona games to the mainline Shin Megami Tensei, and of course, so does the rest of the world because the Persona games have vastly outsold them now. So yeah, okay. So you're in Tokyo, you're a high school kid. and you have these kind of oddly supernatural things going on. That's what makes it like Tokyo Xanadu, right? So it's interesting that I played Tokyo Xanadu and played this. High school kids in Japan, supernatural stuff. However, and there's also kind of like this day cycle. You go to school and you do stuff and then you fight and blah, blah, blah. That's kind of where they divulge, though. There's some really interesting differences. Like, one, just from a deep game design perspective, obviously Persona is turn-based versus the action RPG element of Falcom. And I think that's where advantage Falcom. I'm going to be honest with you. Advantage them. Because I get a little... I love turn-based, don't get me wrong. I like turn-based like the next person, but at least the way it's implemented in this game, Patrick, there's this thing in it where you have affinities, character affinities. So you're fighting a monster that has like an affinity to fire damage, right? And once you figure that out, it actually does essentially a critical attack every single time you pick fire. And it makes battles incredibly easy to win once you figure out how to exploit that system. And so it makes a lot of the regular non-boss fights. Boss fights are still another thing. They're pretty complex, but the non-boss fights become fairly rudimentary once you figure out the affinities. And then once that happens, then the game starts to drag, right? Then it starts to have, and this is all JRPGs. This is a weakness of JRPGs, even though I dearly love them. It didn't used to be my favorite genre. It kind of has become my favorite genre now as I've gotten older, but this is a weakness they have where if the combat can be exploited, it gets grindy in an unpleasant way. Do you have any thoughts on this? I don't think you've gotten to this game yet, Patrick. I know you have it sitting on the shelf, but you've played other Persona games, surely, or other Atlas RPGs in this world. What are your kind of thoughts about my Persona 5 experience?
Yeah, so I've played some of the Shin Megami Tensei games. I have actually not played any of the Persona games because the idea of playing as high schoolers just completely turns me off. But I have played Tokyo Mirage Sessions where you play as high schoolers fighting demons in pursuit of becoming the ultimate singing idol. And a lot of what you said there, I think you just picked up on some of my sarcasm.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, Persona is actually right up my alley, but I just haven't played them yet.
Right.
But essentially, Tokyo Mirage Sessions is the Persona game on Switch, and it has a lot of exactly what you just described, where once you figure out what creatures are weak to, then you can just continue to utilize those. You can practically play it on autopilot at that point where you're just sitting through attack animations, which fortunately on the Switch, they added the ability to fast forward through attack animations. You can't skip, but you can fast forward. So it's got a lot of what you said. Still extremely cool world, extremely cool designs, fantastic music. I love the dungeon layouts.
Yeah.
And the puzzles there in the dungeons, no issues with that. Just the combat eventually does get a little long in the tooth.
Yep, that's it, because I really dig the characters in Persona 5. They're a lot of fun. The music, this is where I made the joke about my wife. My wife hates the music with a passion. Like, she told me that she was joking, she was being facetious, but she said that the Persona 5 soundtrack's the worst part of 2020 for her. I think it's because she doesn't like the jazzy elements that the soundtrack has, would be my guess. But it's an amazing soundtrack. It's so good. And so there's, and yes, the layouts are great. The world, they sort of went for in Persona 5 a pop punk visual aesthetic, and it works really well. I mean, there's so much going on. So why is it that I was able to complete Tokyo Xanadu, which I think is a bit of to be fair, is shorter. But, like, there's other JRPGs, like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I put 300 hours in and completed. And I figured out, like, it's two things. It's the combat, that's a big part of it, because then it starts to make, because a lot of the combat's unavoidable, basically. Like, in Persona 5, you can kind of stealth around enemies, but they make it kind of hard to do that, so you really do have to fight a lot. And once you figure out the affinity system, how to exploit it, it's becomes, as I would say to my game design students, kind of a cardinal strategy, which just never, I think, feels awesome. The other thing is this. So Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which is a game a couple of years ago, I put 300 hours in. Why I was able to do that? There's certainly a lot of repetitious combat in a game like that. Now it's kind of the MMO-ish real time with pause. I don't know if that's quite right, but the sort of you click an attack button, there's a can animation, but it's not turn based, so it's that MMO-ish combat. So it's not quite like Falcom combat, which is very tight, very like actual sort of action game combat. Xenoblade Chronicles does the kind of MMO style sort of thing. So why was I able to hang with that? Well, I think it's because of this. And I understand this is like really expensive, I'm about to say, from a development standpoint. In Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 1, which I put probably about 600 hours into between the two, which is nuts to think about. There's so much to see, right? And that if you can just make it, like, okay, I got to grind to get to level 57, and I'm level 50, and I'm not, so I can get to the next area. There's going to be a really cool new area to see. The games are very linear that way. They're open, and that you can go back to areas you visited before, and you can go back and forth, and you'll need to for side quests or whatever. But the main thrust of the game is this linear. Part 1 takes place here. Part 2 takes place in a completely different place, and Part 3 takes place in another. You're never going back to the same place in those games generally. In Persona, and actually Tokyo Xanadu does this as well, but I think this is where the handheld gives it an advantage. It just doesn't wear out its welcome as fast. You're in Tokyo. You're in Tokyo every day. You're going to that school on most days. Yes, there are areas in Tokyo that open up to you, but they're really just a static screen that you date characters in, right? Like, okay, cool. Asakusa opens up as an area, right? Which is a cool touristy place in Tokyo if you've ever been there. I know you've been there, Patrick. That's a place that opens up. Well, yeah, it's just a screen. It's not like, anywhere that you explore really. And so really every day you're starting out in the same apartment, in the same school, in the same areas. And then, the dungeons you fight in. Now, this is different than other Persona games. The earlier Persona games, I believe they're all basically procedural dungeons. When I think about Tartarus from Persona 3, I think that's more or less kind of a procedural dungeon that you almost like a roguelike concept that you go down into. In Persona 5, you do have bespoke dungeons. Like they are like hand-built, good, cool layouts and everything. But they're meant to be, they're palaces of the mind. They're mental projections of the characters that you're investigating. You're like going into their brain basically. So these are abstract. These are very abstract areas, and they don't have the kind of architectural heft. Like people aren't living there. There's no shops. There's no things about it that make it feel like they're just there for you to have gameplay in, right? So they just don't even though you're exploring these new palaces, which are just dungeons basically, I don't think they do enough to make me feel engaged like in a Xenoblade Chronicles game where I know I'm going to see a cool new town at some point, right? Like with a society that lives there with, you know what I mean? There's just, I feel like the rewards are greater for surviving a long time in games like Xenoblade Chronicles versus this where they're cyclical and you're trying to derive your gameplay from other means. Does that make sense to you, Patrick, or am I like a crazy person?
It does make sense. I haven't actually played Persona 5, but I mean, what it really sounds like you're getting at is you want something, a new, cool area to look forward to, and it sounds like you're not getting that.
That's right.
As you
Yeah.
play.
And that may happen later, but I'm 90 hours in. Right? Like, and so I'm pretty sure, and the whole game is based on a calendar system, day 1, day 2, So I would stick with it too if I knew I just had 5 hours left, but I'm pretty sure I have a big chunk of game left. Pretty sure that I have a lot to go. So, and now I may come back to it perhaps, but for now, I'm gonna put it on the shelf and move on to another game that I'll mention because we are starting to get close to an hour here. So I just started playing Star Ocean, Integrity and Faithfulness, which is interesting because I'm glad I started playing it before I looked at the reviews. It did not get good reviews. But here's the thing. Critics, more than ever, are just wrong about stuff, I find. So I'm not entirely dissuaded by this. So far, it's been, I'm not too deep into it. It's got a cool real-time combat system, so that's already a plus for me. coming off of Persona. Like I like turn-based a lot actually, but just coming off of Persona, even if it was going swimmingly, it's nice that this is, sort of more an action RPG structure. You haven't played this one, Patrick, but you've played other Star Ocean games, yes?
Yeah, I played. Yeah, so the previous one, Star Ocean Last Hope, really good game. They redid it for PS4. I think that's one of the reasons that we were even talking about Star Ocean before, because I know that we were talking about what are some RPGs that are not set in a fantasy world, and we were kind of bumping our heads against each other trying to think of
Right.
them. And the one that came to mind to me was Star Ocean because of Last Hope. But I have not played this one yet. But Last Hope was a great game, which incidentally also had that aspect you're talking about before, because you go from one planet to another planet, and each planet would look different, would have its own society, would have a different set of monsters and creatures to fight. Uh, so it was definitely very rewarding to be like, okay, what am I going to see next? What is this
Right.
next world going to be like? And some worlds were better than others, but just knowing that you were going to see an entirely new environment and culture was pretty cool.
Right. So yeah, and that for me anyway, kind of wraps up my year in gaming. It's funny. I had a lot of really good experiences. I didn't have a magical, sort of mind blowing gaming experience this year. I just had a lot of good ones. Last year, obviously with Death Stranding, which I just loved to death, loved it so much. That was, a mind blowing, just, amazing experience. I didn't have anything like that. I had a lot of good experiences. How about you, Patrick? Any other games you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, another one that I've been playing quite a bit lately, and I know this actually came out a couple of years ago, is Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate on the
Ah,
Switch.
yes.
Um, yeah, because I know that I'd actually been haranguing you for a while trying to get you to play it, and
Now
eventually I
you're
just
being funny. Listen to this guy. Listen to this guy.
is this an objection? Um,
That's a Phoenix
anyway,
Wright objection. Yes.
um, but at this point, I've put in some hours on it. I don't know if I'm up to 200 yet, but I know that I'm over 150 hours on it. Pretty good game. Uh, it's got that whole Monster Hunter thing going for it. I've played Monster Hunter World, Monster Hunter 4, 3, etc. Um, yeah, good game. Still addicted, hopelessly.
So I'm gonna fill in some context here, because I have to now. Basically, this game's been out for a few years on the Switch. Okay, Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. It's obviously a remaster, enhanced remaster of Monster Hunter Generations that was on the 3DS before. It's on. I put it on the screen now for those viewing, the YouTube version of this. So yeah, okay. So it's this 3DS game that gets updated. Now we had played Monster Hunter World and of course loved it. We did a podcast on it actually, so check it out. And but we are kind of done with that. And we have Patrick and I and some other friends. We have a weekly game night where we play multiplayer games. And I remember telling him and everyone else, hey, we should grab this on the Switch. Yes, we've played it before, but we've already had good experiences when Monster Hunter 3, Monster Hunter Tri Ultimate or Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, I forget what they called it. When that came out on the Wii U, we had a really good time with that. Even though we had played it on the Wii, maybe you hadn't, Patrick. Actually, I can't remember, but so we had a good experience with their remastered. They remasters. They add things to it or whatever. And you could even now this didn't affect you, Patrick, because you nuked your save or whatever. But you can take your old 3DS save and transfer it over. So that was pretty cool too. So I didn't actually lose that old progress. So, I'd been hectoring everyone forever. And finally it was on sale online for like $20 or something. And that's when we all got it. Now, of course, it went on sale. Like I saw it at like my local Meijer for like $5 as a physical copy, recently. But that's fine. But the irony here is that it hasn't been myself or the other fellow, actually Jason, who's been on the podcast before. that has put the enormous amounts of time in it. Patrick, it's been you. You are hopelessly addicted. You are grinding. You are Timmy power gamering this.
I hit HR 11 tonight.
There you go. Right. So, and you were the strongest resistor. You were the one that would say, "I'm just so spoiled by Monster Hunter World, I cannot go back to the old engine," and yada yada yada. But here you are. The systems are so. I mean, look, you're right about one thing. Monster Hunter World is, orders of magnitude, slicker. I'm not gonna say better, but it's slick. It's much more slick, right? The environments are they're for modern consoles and PC, so they're really intricate, and they're there's even a lot of really good, I think, service to the player that happens in Monster Hunter World. I mean, things are just easier to do in general. There's a lot of really good things, but here's the thing: Monster Hunter is still, as it turns out, Monster Hunter. All those things that made it addictive and a worldwide phenomenon for Capcom are still present in this older remastered game, as it turns out. So that's been kind of gratifying to see, I think. So anything else, Patrick, that you want to bring up gaming-wise to sort of wrap up our year in review?
Nope. I think that that hits the things that came immediately to mind.
All right, so again, I want to thank everyone for listening throughout the year. I do want to apologize for the lack of content between October and basically in October and November. It's probably been the deadest that we've been in terms of getting stuff out. It was a real 2020 time. I'll just put it that way. A lot of stuff going on, and it just got difficult to do. And that's also what kind of made me reflect on, like, hey, not that I wasn't reflecting on whether or not to do the podcast. That I really like doing it, and so that wasn't really a question. It was that, hey, what are some things that we can do to make the podcast so much fun for us to do that there's never these big gaps. And I thought, well, we have lots of other things to talk about, and we should broaden the horizons. But then, it doesn't make any sense to call it grid snaps if you're talking about Columbo or keto dieting. That's something that Kip wants to do down the line, right? Like all these disparate things that we have to talk about. We should be able to talk about them here. And people are. If you're into the gaming stuff, then you'll listen to or view those, right? So it just made sense to me to do that. But thank you for listening. And one thing, Patrick, this is actually basically our third anniversary show. This show has been running for 3 years now. Did you know that?
That's a long time.
It is. Like, there's a lot of podcasts, and I know this because I look at podcasts. I look them up, and it's like, oh, like you did 5 episodes and then just got bored of it, right? So I feel like that we should be proud of this, that we've maintained this for 3 years. There's almost like 100 episodes now, so you can just, if you wanted to, you can hear my voice for like a week straight if you wanted to. I don't know why you would want to, but you could. All right, so Patrick, let's go ahead and bid our audience adieu, not just for this podcast, but adieu. Adieu for the year 2020. Obviously, famously, not the greatest year in the world, but hopefully it was good for you anyway, and I hope 2021 is awesome for you and even better. So until next time, everybody,